Okay, thank you, David, and hello everyone in Cannes. The international press is facing a very tough time at the moment in a very difficult world. On the surface, everything seems to be going digital and hurtling into a digital black hole. But dig beneath the surface and what are the real trends for press volumes and also what are the issues that we need to address. It's those two questions which lie at the core of this report, the Distripress Circulation Monitor. The report itself has got three key inputs: global sales trends, that we've reviewed all the major sources of press volumes, that's newspapers and magazines, to create our own estimates of what's been going on in 2011, 2012, 2013. The second input is a survey of Distripress members, where we polled 196 members in 47 countries. And then the final focus is to zoom in on 9 particular countries where we dug into a lot more detail. They are Australia, France, Germany, Poland, South Africa, Spain, Russia, the UK and the USA. So those are the three key inputs into the report. The report itself is structured around 4 sections. The first is the global press context, the big picture of what's going on around the world. Secondly, the sales volume trends, where we are looking from the bottom up at over 70 countries. Then we move on to the dynamics and the issues that lie behind cross-border distribution. And finally, we look at the shape of the supply chain in the home markets of Distripress members. So what I want to do in this presentation is just to give you a very quick outline of what is a very detailed report, but to give you a flavour as to what is actually in there. So where are we going to start? We're going to have a look at the global press context, the context in which we all operate. One of the key indicators, one of the most useful indicators, is to look at the broad economic context for media and to look at real advertising spend. This graph shows the global ad spend across all media at constant prices, so that's with inflation taken out. It runs from 1995 through to projections for 2015, 2016. Those are from Zenith Optimedia. And you can see on the graph the 2 main world recessions, back in 2001, 2002, where the average drop per year for the 2 years of recession was minus 3.1%. Move on to 2008, 2009, a bigger dip, the average per year being minus 7.3%, and that's in real terms of real advertising spend. But then from 2010 onwards, there is strong and steady growth, with the projection for the last 2 years of 2015, 2016 of it being plus 3.1% per year. So the general context is that the media, in its broadest sense, is looking very healthy indeed. If we zoom in on newspapers and magazines, then we see that newspapers and magazines are actually losing share. The 2015-2016 projection for all media, as we've seen, is plus 3.1% per year. For newspapers and magazines, it is down, and it's down minus 3.9% per year. The trend is also very variable from region to region for newspapers and magazines, with Latin America, Middle East and Africa leading and having the most buoyant figures, through to North America, which has the most depressing figures, minus 6% year on year. The report then looks behind these general trends at some of the key variables. Variables which can make the publisher's business model look very different from country to country. In particular, and I'd pick out the balance between circulation revenue and advertising revenue, and the publishing model actually varies significantly from country to country, as do the dominant distribution channels. For the report, we're zooming in on paid for retail, but also paid for direct and free and digital are key channels for our media. The magazine variables, there are some specific ones here, as the magazine market is much more varied and much more erratic. Retail versus subscriptions being a key variable. Ranges from Poland, only 3% of Polish consumer magazine sales are via subscription, goes up to 98% for South Korea. The global average is 39% of total magazine volumes going via subscription. And those are gradually, slowly edging upwards in most of the markets. Value versus volume is another key measure that we look at. We zoom in on the 9 focus countries where cover prices are currently rising in the magazine sector at just over 3% per year. So a fairly consistent picture across most of those major markets. But the whole issue about the magazine business is that it is fragmenting, it's fracturing into a range of micro markets. Again, we track those as to see what the hot markets are. For example, juvenile titles, titles aimed at children, are relatively buoyant in most sectors. At the other extreme, the men's lifestyle are very depressed, very sharply declining in most of the markets that we look at. But essentially the magazine business looks as though it's fracturing into 4 key segments. Weeklies, secondly lifestyle monthlies, both of those are under intense pressure and we don't know when we're going to hit bottom on those markets, if ever. But there are also the other 2, specialist monthlies, which are relatively buoyant, and premium. Premium is bookazines, collectibles, part works, high cover price, high value products. So that's an overview of the overall context. If we move on to the second section and have a look at the engine room, the sales volume trends, and I just flash up this chart here which summarises globally what's going on with print sales volumes for newspapers and magazines. And it's comparing 2012 with 2011 and then the percentage change more recently 2013 versus 2012. Newspapers, you see plus 0.9, slowing down to plus 0.4. Now, China and India, amazingly, between them account for almost 48% of total newspaper sales volumes. They account for a much smaller proportion of value because their cover prices are very low. But strip China and India out of the volume figures and the newspaper market is turning into one of steady and accelerating decline, as the magazine business is also. That is also declining and at a faster rate than newspapers. If we drop down a level and look at newspaper volumes by region, a lot of figures on that chart, but just to pick out 2 in particular. On the top line, Asia Pacific, 68%. The massive importance of Asia Pacific in the global picture of what's happening to newspapers. The most buoyant sector, and at the other extreme, the most sharply declining sector is Western Europe, which is down minus 6.4%. A very quick look at the similar picture for magazines, again picking out just 2 factors from this particular table. The key thing that if Asia Pacific drives newspapers, it is Western Europe which still drives magazines. 41% of global total sales volumes for magazines come from Western Europe. Western Europe only accounts for about 11% of newspapers. So Europe is still the homeland and the core for the magazine business. I think that just gives you a bit of a flavour as to the level of detail that there is in the report. But behind these volume trends, there are a number of issues, which is what the 3rd section of the report looks at cross-border distribution. A few facts and figures here. We estimate that about 6% of total global sales volume are cross-border. They start in one country and they end up in another. So it's a significant niche in 21st century publishing. Talking to and polling the views of the Distripress members, 39% of the businesses involved in this cross-border distribution are actually saying their businesses are growing or are steady. So it isn't an overall, an overwhelming picture of doom and gloom. Looking at the publishers, their export operations, 70% of them say that their export operations are making a profit. 89% have a promotional budget specifically for cross-border international sales, so there is focus and resource going into this whole area. And it's still very retail biased. 73% of the total volumes are via retail in international sales. 20% are subscriptions, that's growing, and a modest 7% are digital, but that is growing also. We asked Distripress members what are the key factors that are shaping these export trends, and they went into two grades. The primary grade, the most important ones, are clearly the editorial quality of the products that we're distributing, but the quality of the distribution network, the supply chain, but also of the retail network are key and critical issues. At the secondary level, cover pricing is important, as is local advertising and marketing in order to drive increased retail sales. But then we zoomed in on what Distripress members felt the opportunities and the barriers to increasing retail sales actually were. The primary ones, having a wider range of titles, which I think is a really interesting one. Whereas so much of the supply chain is talking about rationalising range, the people involved at the front end actually want a wider range of titles to meet the changing and the fragmenting and the niching requirements of the end consumer. But linked to that, more retailers and more retail space within those retailers. At a secondary level, the Distripress members wanted better supply chain processes and a more sensitive understanding and adapting of cover prices to the local market and local market conditions. But also there was seen to be opportunity in rising markets. That means both editorial categories, the hot categories, but also particular markets, and Latin America and Asia Pacific being two specific examples. The barriers, the obvious one, the biggie, is digital competition, but there is a recurring theme of there being fewer retailers handling newspapers and magazines, and of there being less space dedicated within those retailers to news and mags. Secondary issues, rising costs, that tends to be logistics and transport, but general cost increases. Economic instability in specific markets, pricing, and generally the feeling is that the consumer price of imported product is still too high, and a concern about wholesaling, the instability of the wholesale network in a number of countries, and of dropping service levels as wholesalers reduced and cut costs. I think a number of these issues are summed up in a couple of quotes from the report. We need more of everything, a wider range of imported product, more retailers, more space within those retailers. A quote from the member survey. And another quote, we have to move outside our traditional retail networks into new stores and new formats. If we don't, then we'll simply not get in front of the consumer. So that sets the scene then. Let's move on to the fourth section of the report, where we look in at the home market. So not just looking at international press distribution, but what is happening to the supply chain in the local markets. And here again, a few facts and figures. In terms of retail universes, 82% of the countries reporting say that their retail universes are shrinking, and where we've been able to monitor it, it looks to be reducing at an average of about 2% in terms of shop numbers year on year. Retail densities we have a look at, that is the number of retailers per head of population, and there are some massive differences from country to country, even within Western Europe. But particularly important is retail profiles, because although most of the retail types that you can see around the world exist somewhere in each country, their relative importance is very different from country to country. Street kiosks, for example, don't feature at all in the UK market, or under 1% of sales, whereas they're massively important in countries like France and Spain. But the key one is supermarkets. For the focus countries, we look at supermarket share. Spain has the lowest, with only 5% of consumer magazine sales going via supermarket. South Africa at the top end, 63%. Now, these influential and disruptive retailers are shaping the whole retail universe in each of these countries. They affect the market shares, they affect the margins that the supply chain make. The approaches to range and display within retail is very much determined by what the supermarkets are up to, as are supply chain processes. And it's interesting polling the views of some countries which have actively discouraged and tried to slow down supermarket penetration because of their fears as to where it's going to lead, that those countries that have low supermarket penetration are actually very vulnerable to all kinds of other issues as well, which we'll come on to in a moment. Another key factor is looking at buoyant channels. We asked Distripress members which are the retail channels that you see as the most positive at the moment. Supermarkets overwhelmingly, and grocery came out top. But in second place, travel points, but also discounters, whether they are discount warehouse clubs, as in the States, or pound stores, 99p stores in the UK. We also look at press range. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence about the number of magazines and newspapers being stocked, of range reducing. We have a quote from in the report some UK work that Smith's News undertook, which shows that magazine range is reducing by about 6% in the UK year on year in terms of the number of titles being handled. So putting together these key retail trends, there is a shrinking retail universe, declining numbers handling the press, reducing ranges of press products as the pressures on display space within all retailers is increasing. Fluid retail types. It's more difficult to categorize retailers now than ever before as they flex their product range, as they flex their consumer offers. And that filters through into supermarkets and convenience. Supermarkets are growing in virtually every market, and convenience is growing in many markets, but not in all. In America, for example, the convenience format is losing share, whereas in the UK it's growing very strongly. But also linked to that is the weakness of the independents, particularly street kiosks. In Russia, for example, 1,500 street kiosks lost in a year, reducing the number to 30,000, with a projection that within 5-6 years it's going to go down to 20,000. So massive losses in the independent sector, and particularly in independent street kiosks, which leads on to the erosion of press specialists as generalists grow in importance, and the focus on non-traditional outlets as publishers look to build as many contacts with the end consumer as possible through places like coffee shops, garden centres, offices, and so on. So those are the key retail trends. We go behind that and look at some of the supply chain issues. 71% of respondents in the Distripress survey, 71% of the countries are seeing structural change in their supply chain, 14% seeing very radical change. The key change is the consolidation and instability in wholesaling. Yes, there are retail issues, and we've already touched on them, about the numbers of press retailers, their product range they handle, the margins that they are increasingly demanding, the changes to the process, and with a background shift out of the independent sector into multiples. But we also asked some specific issues. We listed a number of supply chain issues and asked the respondents to put on a score of 1 to 10 as to how important they felt they were. The three that come out top, protecting retail shelf space, copy allocations, getting the number of copies into each individual outlet, getting that initial copy allocation correct, but also, once the copies are there, of having innovative retail promotions. Important, but at a secondary level, is data, whether that's EPOS data from retail or wholesale data. Critically important in driving copy allocations, but not as important as getting that front-end consumer context right. And then finally, sales-based replenishment and scan-based trading. These have relatively low scores across the survey because they are not operating in all of the markets that we've reviewed. But where they do work, they are very important and also can be very controversial, particularly scan-based trading. So that's a very quick summary as to what the report has picked up in terms of what is going on. It's a flavour and the detail of what is, I think, a very significant benchmarking report. But what does it all mean? Let's have a look at a few of the key conclusions. The obvious one is that we are working in a very challenging environment where the two key trends are the disruption caused by digital and the long, slow drift out of retail and into one-to-one subscriptions. There are challenging distribution issues as well, whether they are retail pressures, wholesaler distributor pressures, or just general cost pressures, particularly in the area of logistics. But despite all these challenges, there are some bright spots. There are recovering economies around the world, that international cross-border sales are a significant and remain a significant and profitable niche within publishing, and there is growth. There are growth markets, particularly particular sectors of the world. There are growth sectors, categories of magazine and newspapers, and ultimately there is a great confidence in the fact that we have quality products, that we work in a strong and vibrant and creative industry, which means that at the end of the survey that the attitudes of Distripress members are still relatively robust, that the mood is one of steely realism rather than of panic. And attitudes and how we approach the challenges is critically important. Because essentially there appear to be three approaches open to the industry. The first is to actively accelerate the decline of press. And some publishers in some countries are committing to digital and deliberately slowing down their press operations, which I think, looking at the speed at which digital revenue is coming on stream, is a very odd and a very dangerous thing to do. There is a group of operators who are passively accepting the decline, where companies consolidate and cut costs and accept the inevitable. But the third group is to re-engineer for a different world, that our world of press distribution will never be the same again. There is no going back to old volumes, to old margins, to old ways of doing things. But with more creativity and lateral thinking, more dynamism, there is still a positive and a profitable future, but only if we take the initiative. And that thought is summed up in the final quote from the report from one of the, actually I think this is a wholesaler who said this, that our industry is not very innovative or proactive. Change usually only happens due to retailer pressure rather than our initiative. We have to change that mentality to survive. We have to take control of our own destiny. And if there is an overriding message from the Distripress Monitor, it's that. Thank you.
Jim, we're going to say goodbye from sunny Cannes. I hope to see you soon.
Oh, my heart bleeds.
And we wish, hopefully you can join us next year in Brussels. We'll talk about that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much.
Okay, have a good conference.